What is your most optimistic mindset for these times?
I've given this quite a lot of thought, actually, and it's a fascinating subject. Just going back a little bit, I believe, very, very profoundly believe, that everyone is born with an optimistic mindset. That is the nature of being human, basically. When you're born, you're born with a tabula rasa, with nothing. And the situation is that as time goes on, this optimistic mindset that you're born with, or this tendency to be optimistic, can either be exaggerated, can be built upon, or it can be undermined. And I was born with that naturally optimistic mindset. And because of my upbringing, but from my parents, despite my awful schooling, I remain a sanguine individual. I'm optimistic by nature. I see the world as an essentially benign place. I see people mostly as good and trustworthy. I don't automatically distrust people. I tend to think that all will be well. And it usually is. In my life, it usually is. Things usually turn out for the good. I know it is a function of my upbringing. And I think it's also a function of the fact that I have worked on it. I do actually work on my own optimism. It's also backed up by a pattern in my luck. And I'm going to quote from another book I've recently written. There is often a certain pattern in the nature of my luck, a pattern that I must never count upon or take for granted at the risk of angering the fates. Here is the pattern. 1, something awful happens. I fall off a cliff. I find my aging camper van won't start on the morning of a departure to the continent. I lose my job in wretched circumstances. 2, somehow these all have satisfactory endings, endings that from which I learn, or from which I derive even more happiness, as if maybe I still have something to learn from disaster, or a capricious fate is playing games with me, not quite ready to dispose of me entirely. I survived my fall almost entire with a renewed love of poetry and a chastened awareness of how others' suffering is often worse than my own. The camper van's repaired on time, and we win an extra hour out of the blue. And the loss of my job leads to new discoveries and fresh working pastures, and so on. I don't trust to that luck, but it sort of happens that way. That, if you like, bolsters my optimistic mindset. And also, I'm someone who's never bored. I don't really know what boredom is. I've always got something to do, a book to read, people to contact, domestic chores to do, more writing to do. There's always something to do and something to occupy my mind and something to keep me busy and optimistic. So lockdown has had a very minor impact on my optimistic mindset. What frustrates me most, actually, is the knowledge that many people, probably the majority of people, are not so fortunate. They're folk, in many cases, who were already suffering before lockdown: the old, the infirm, the poor, the single, the overwhelmed, the out of work, the frustrated young, all those about whom I can do very little. So the best thing I can do, I think, is to keep up my own spirits and sustain my own optimistic mindset. And that way, I'm of more use to others.
What have you done to realize your life vision?
I did achieve my ambition for my career, in the sense that I reached the pinnacle of the teaching profession, in the sense that I became a head. But looking back on that, I wish I hadn't. I wish I hadn't been thinking in that linear way that I must get to that position. And that's what had been drilled into me from the start, because that did not lead to my happiness. I absolutely feel driven to do the best I possibly can for others, for my family, for my community, for others around me. So the one has led into the other, that my optimism has fed my life, and it's particularly feeding my retirement. And I'm very, very happy in my retirement and want to pass that happiness on as much as I can to others.